Frank Stillwell. My parents treated me quite nicely, actually, which is probably a good start in life, other than being born to a very wealthy family, which is probably the better road to perpetual privilege. I just wanted to say congratulations to you both for excellent speeches. Obviously, you're concerned to link in young people's concerns with broader concerns about the whole society and our collective future, if any. But I particularly wanted to drill on that last issue about social justice, revolutionary change, and how, for example, a campaign for same-sex marriage fits into this. Because among the other concerns you mentioned, there's lots of social justice issues that will mobilise small L liberals around injustices. But to then posit that this is all part of a sort of a more revolutionary movement for fundamental social change is a much taller order. And I wanted to ask both of you, to what extent you think young people are willing to mobilise around those bigger structural changes rather than the smaller reforms like same-sex marriage?
Getting my thoughts together. Well, I think that it does seem like a bit of a stretch, especially when we're looking to today in Australia. Same-sex marriage is not a revolutionary demand. It's a very, very easy, basic legal right to obtain, and moreover, it's a demand that even a section of the ruling class supports in Australia. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any like huge dissimilarity between 50,000 people getting involved in a rally for same-sex marriage rights, as what happened a couple of Sundays ago, and actually building a revolutionary movement. And the reason is because we need to build the left, I think, and the thing that will do that is struggle, and whatever terrain it is given to us, I think, is as revolutionaries, is something that we should fight on. At the moment, same-sex marriage is not just this like really simple legal right that we could obtain. It's also a way of fighting the right in our society. The people who are on the side of the No campaign are not just right-wing when it comes to homophobia and transphobia as well, as they've outed themselves to be. They're also right-wing on every question, not just social questions, economic questions too. They want to lock up and torture refugees. They're happy to drive the issue of Islamophobia further and further to the right, always even conflating these things to talk about how the rabid, gender-bending left wants to introduce Sharia law and all of that kind of garbled nonsense. They're warriors for the 1% as well. Tony Abbott is not, I think, surprising that he is one of the leading voices in the No campaign, but then also the same person who wants to, gut higher education, who wanted to deregulate student fees, and also wanted to go on union busting exercises and all the rest of it. So I think, the stretch is, or rather not so big a stretch, is whatever steps it will take to build our side, to mobilise the left, to get more and more people involved in struggle, and that's the kind of thing that's important. And when that's young people, even just rebuilding the sense that when there's an injustice, you protest it. That's not exactly a common sense idea at the moment. So it's whatever next step you can take towards mobilising people and opening their horizons as well to struggle around other injustices as well, I think is an important thing.
Thank you so much for a very informative talk. Okay, now, the engagement of the younger generation politically in issues of social justice and the rise of social inequality between the 1% and the rest of us is evidenced in the mass participation of the younger generation in political movements such as Momentum, a grassroots network of youth supporting the democratic socialist ideals of Jeremy Corbyn, and Our Revolution, a grassroots network of youth supporting the democratic socialist ideals of Bernie Sanders. do you regard this as an encouraging political development which gives all of us, young and old, some small reason for optimism in these dark times? And what do you think of an interview recently on ABC Lateline with ex-Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who, when asked her views as to the popularity amongst young people of the open advocacy of democratic socialism by Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, sardonically replied, quote, "It does give me cause for a smile that, apparently, the champions of youth today are these old men with quite old economic models," end of quote. Isn't it rather the case that a return to the principles, ideals and values of the old models has captivated the imagination of young people, freed from the ideological baggage of the Cold War, as a means of dealing with the perennial social justice issues that we all suffer?
I don't know if it's much of an answer instead of largely agreeing with what you've said. I think, the mass youth participation in Momentum and grassroots network is very encouraging, and I think it's what we need to be seeing more of is grassroots organising and grassroots activism that young people are able to get involved in. But I think the reason why young people have gotten so on board and so involved in, the campaigns of Corbyn and Sanders is because of the difference in ideals that they were offering that you highlighted at the end there. And it is quite disappointing to me to see Gillard kind of making a joke out of Corbyn, because I think that's what the Australian Labor Party needs is a bit of Corbynism in it. I'm not necessarily like a revolutionary socialist, but I think that the Labor Party in Australia could learn a lot from Corbyn and what he's done to reignite the left and reignite not just the youth movement, but the socialist movement within politics. And I think that's something that we should all be taking a lesson from, rather than mocking it as Gillard seems to do, and as a lot of Australian politicians, and not even Australian politicians, centrist UK politicians are doing. So I think that's, important.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly, it's a cause for optimism, and we always, as Marxists, think that this is going to be the case, that support for alternatives will actually increase because of the way that capitalism drives people to look for something different to answer their grievances. But obviously the form of it sometimes takes us by surprise, and that is the case that this party, the neoliberal Blairites had free run of it for so long, could produce this figure, or he was waiting in the wings, and now thousands, millions of people, young people, support him. And same with Bernie Sanders as well. The fact that people can actually say that they're a socialist in a country, tens of thousands, millions of people say they're socialist now in a country with anti-communist campaigns being pushed for 50 plus years, 60, whatever, for ages. I think that's a real cause for optimism, and really shows that, that kind of thing could happen here as well. Society is very similar to our own. I think with the Julia Gillard interview, I think it's not surprising at all that she's very disparaging of the left and young left-wing people, because she's not of the left. She's not a left-wing person. She's never had a left-wing bone in her body, I don't think. And the thing about using, the saying that, they're old men, it's just like using, people's support for anti-sexism to wedge the left, and, to say that, if you're a young person that supports gender equality, you should support me. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything when you're, selling the same kind of vision of neoliberal austerity that a lot of young people around the world are trying to reject. And it's the same with the kind of Clinton phenomenon in the US as well. The collapse, or she's not really a phenomenon, it's the other way around, really. The collapse of support for her as well, I think.
I suppose being an older person, one spends one's life trying to make sense of what has happened and look for what are the driving dynamics of the political situation in which we find ourselves. It seems to me that the idea of the market came from the idea that markets were restricted before the Second World War And at Bretton Woods, they said, well, if countries that were doing well could simply rise and ones that were doing badly could fall, the market would fix that and we wouldn't have any more wars. And that, of course, had the market ideology grafted onto it. And it seems then that everything was commodified, in particular housing, education, and health, which effectively commodifies the human body. So we've now reached this stage of commodification of everything, and the whole system becomes a monopoly game, which is now reaching the end stages where the right want to keep the game going a little bit longer to just screw that last bit out of the people before they fight. Now that seems to me, looking at a lifetime of observing as to what has happened, and it seems to me that the older generation, like myself, whose house has got richer faster than I have just by existing, which really is quite an extraordinary statement when you think about it, and particularly in terms of I could actually sell it and make more money than I've actually earned in my whole life. And of course someone else's debt will pick that up, which is extraordinary, but it does emphasise that if I can hand it to my kid, he's okay, but God help the others. And I think that's where the young people are. So I suppose, I mean, you've nailed your colours to the mast as a Marxist and said, look, we've got a revolution here. That's how it's going to go, kid. And I mean, I don't suppose as a speaker in politics in the pub that should rock me with surprise. But I was wondering, Isabella, if you don't take that position, what can be done? Do the young people have any ideas? My generation's wimped out, mate. No, wait, we're coasting home. What do you reckon?
In terms of... I think revolutionary socialism, is this kind of what I'm meant to be answering? I think it... I don't disagree with it. I know this is probably a weird angle to take. I don't disagree with it at all. I studied political economy for a very long time, and I completely agree with what you said about the commodification of seemingly everything, and especially the commodification of education is something that I'm acutely aware of and something that I have experienced. But yeah, I don't know if there is an alternative, to be honest. I think the more I get through politics, the more I do kind of see the failings of our political system, and I don't know if I honestly can say that there is an alternative. But yeah, I think that's something that I'm working out in my ideology. I can't strongly say that I have a alternative at the moment, but yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question.
You and the rest of the world, mate.
Thanks very much to the speakers. Excellent talks. I just want to address what seems to me to be a structural challenge facing young people, and in relation to the workforce today. And that is, I was listening, talking of old people, I was listening to Philip Adams' program, and one of the speakers said, and I nearly fell off my chair, that a young person graduating from high school is likely to have 70 jobs. Is that right? I thought, can that be right? I don't know. Did anyone else hear that? Or did I mishear that? 70 jobs in their lifetime. 17? Oh, okay. All right. Well, even 17. Look, what I'm saying is there's a structural change here. You know, people of my generation, okay, you had a certain number of jobs in your lifetime. There was even a concept that you had a job for life, which is probably in reality a bit of a myth anyway, but there was an idea, you know, you work for the railways, or you work for public service, or you work for a corporation. In Japan, of course, they had that idea. I'm sure it doesn't happen there anymore. But we have the digital economy and the gig economy and all this sort of thing. And I thought to myself, when people were addressing this idea of the casual work that's facing there, it's a structural challenge to the future generation as to how we're going to organise, or how the new working class, the youth working class, are going to organise. That's an incredible problem, to have 17 jobs even, or 70 jobs. I heard 70, I must have been wrong. I'm getting the old-timers disease, but it's a lot. And how do you transfer that, you know, between those jobs and maintain the structural organisation of the working class, which is where we got to where we are today? If we have any rights, if we have penalty rates, if we have all these things to do to union organisation. And I find it's a challenge to me. How are we going to reorganise the trade union movement in Australia, and how are we going to win young people to be members of unions and to change the structure of unions to be flexible enough to deal with this new economy? It's an incredible challenge to me that we can have a strong trade union movement, which historically has been the case in Australia but has been much weakened. How are we going to face the problem of defending the working class rights of young people into the future? If you could say something about that.
I'm not necessarily the best at brief, but because I think that often things require a bit of explanation. Well, I think that for starters, that the trade union movement has always had challenges. Capitalism doesn't just make it easy for trade union organisation to occur, even in the best of times. So I think that this kind of new challenges, they're not exactly necessarily all that new. I actually gave a talk about this topic at the Socialism conference that we put on every August. And I think the insecurity of work at the moment it's true. It's a problem. It's terrible. But you only have to look at the way that a lot of work was organised in the early part of the 20th century to know that this is not just some kind of new insurmountable barrier. One of the most militant union organisations was around the docks. Actually, dock workers had to queue up every day for work. You didn't know whether you had any secure work from one day to the next. And yet, dock workers, again, one of the most militant sections of the Australian working class still remains to be one of the most militant sections of the working class. I think that it just need to do the same things that the union movement has always done, organising around bread and butter issues to kind of actually fight for people's wages, conditions, etc. But also, I think at the moment, and I think this is where the union movement is most hamstrung, there's these huge attacks coming, penalty rates, ABCC, all the rest of it, and there hasn't been an adequate response to that on a national level, I don't think. And I think part of that actually has to do with the politics of the union movement and where its loyalties lie there, with the Labor Party actually, and prioritising that over actually fighting these large-scale attacks coming from the ruling class. So I think that both of those things need to happen, both bread and butter issues at the workplace level to build up that rank and file organisation and organising just there, and then also responding to big-scale challenges.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that was said. I can talk about the youth participation in unions till the sun comes home. It's one of my biggest concerns for these generations is already we're seeing so many young people not feeling as though they have to be in their union. And I just foresee that increasing if something doesn't change within unions themselves. I think unions tend to be so wrapped up in their own bureaucracy that they don't focus on the key facet of unions, which is organising and mobilising workers. And I think that is not going to come from the unions themselves. That's going to come from the workers and the rank and file members making a change and working to organise with or without the authority of the unions. And I think that young people are doing that already in issues that do affect them, and it is things like penalty rates, it is things like even young people mobilising their workplaces in support of same-sex marriage, and I think that's what's going to have to continue rather than relying on unions themselves to make a change and organise for us, yeah.
Just briefly from the chair, I mean, whether you're in a union or not, there's two elements in the equation that we all have to struggle with. One is about the provision of a basic income, and the second part of the issue is about redefining what you mean by work in relation to that first issue. And that's the thinking which is imperative for all of us. Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a student at Sydney University as well, and so a self-proclaimed young person. I guess one of the things that really struck me, like listening to these speeches, is that in the context of, I think, Australian society, but also globally, both of the arguments really are quite radical. Isabella saying that systematic institutional change is needed, and obviously the entire content, I think, of Hersha's speech, talking about actually replacing capitalism with socialism. But that actually, in other periods of history, these sort of arguments would be rather humdrum. I'm reminded particularly of the generation of the 68 in Europe and all around the world, for whom, the idea that society is fundamentally corrupt and that we need to transform it entirely was quite taken for granted on the entire sort of left wing of society. And by the same token, in a way, looking at sort of mainstream Australian politics, the fact that these views have absolutely no representation in what is known as official politics. The furthest left that we have, the Greens, is still far from, Di Natale himself very specifically said, we are not anti-capitalist, we are not an anti-capitalist party, we want to work within the system. Because I think that it is the crucial question, actually, of how do we address these questions? How do we address these issues of social justice? Is it by trying to work within the institutions that exist, or is it by trying to transform them from, for example, the bottom up, in relation to the sort of social movements in particular that we've gone over? I think that is...
You'll have to come to a question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So I guess the question that I have then is that the missing link really is political representation of these radical ideas. Even if we talk about Bernie Sanders, for example, I think that millions of people, yes, in America call themselves socialists, and that is incredibly important, but that energy has been channeled into, one of the main capitalist parties of the world, the Democratic Party, and that is a serious problem. And so at this point, and other radical movements of the past sort of decades, the Occupy, for example, again, that energy, again, focused largely in the youth, has dissipated. And I think that is to do with the fact that there is no organised radical political party, a revolutionary party specifically. And I guess I just wanted to ask, what do you guys think about that? Why is that important at all? Do you think it is important? And what could we do about it?
I think that it's true that the key question for any left-wing person is still actually reform versus revolution, the question posed by Luxemburg and many others, whether you want to go through the institutions or change from the bottom up. And I think that, if you, when there's more and more people want to the idea that you need revolutionary change, you'll be able to see these the energy of these movements less able to be dissipated and channeled back into institutions that support the status quo, because people will have lost their illusions in it, I guess. I think that how do I put it? I think that the fact that these movements started at all is a cause for celebration, and I think that if even us at this point, even if a small layer of people came to these revolutionary conclusions, that'd be a win. But I think that's not enough. We do actually need to get organised into a revolutionary kind of organisation in order to see that these channels avoided, and that they're not just able to stabilise capitalism the next time there's some kind of big challenge. I agree largely with what the questionnaire. I don't know what kind of word that is, but the person who asked the question, I agree with the content of that as well, and how important it is to kind of look outside those institutions.
Geoffrey, the convening committee. I just wanted to add some things that you have not mentioned from your perspective. And I learned from the millennials by writing my questions on my mobile phone. We have a quadrillion dollar derivatives market that's 20 times the combined GNPs of countries. Can you imagine that? We have the encroachment of a surveillance state and machines rapidly taking over even managerial and supervisory jobs. At the same time, educational institutions admitting that they cannot prepare the youth for the jobs of the future. We have banks and corporations encroaching public interests, once jealously guarded by politicians who are now willing to sell out to the highest bidder. But at the same time, we have individuals challenging banks and governments by creating their own currencies. Before, industrial revolutions and economic upheavals have always been harbingers of new political ideologies and economic thought. Are you satisfied with the very frameworks that both the left and the right are offering you? Because if you're saying, again, the same old line of, we must organize, 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 that mantra, and at the same time, you see the left having the same echo chambers that corporations have in terms of groupthink, and party hierarchies in the same way corporations have their ladders and snakes. Shouldn't you be questioning the very frameworks that both the left and the right are offering you, and still you want to organize on the same frameworks? Isn't something wrong with the framework as well, of both sides? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm totally not, I'm not necessarily sure where this question is coming from. I think that, there's, I don't know, newness for newness sake. It's not necessarily the thing where there are actually real challenges in the world, and the question is not to be innovative, it's to win and figure out how to do that. And actually, the left is not an echo chamber. The left's demands actually resonate with a lot of times with the vast majority of the population. Sometimes at least a significant minority. Stunned to think that would be the case, but I think we want to win, and we do want to organise, because I think that the alternative is to just sit and think, and that never changes anything really. Actually, individuals, questioning the system and its setup, you have to do something about it, and the way you do that is to get organised, and that means organising in unions. If you're a revolutionary, that means getting involved in a revolutionary organisation. It means organising campaigns around specific demands like same-sex marriage, so there's something wrong with the right and their framework, because it seeks to keep the status quo. If you're against the status quo, you've got to do something to change it, and I think organising is the way to go.
Look, Joffre, in response to, there is an ideological, a theoretical, and a skill base to a lot of thinking about the common good, which deals with inequality, which deals with corporate institutional power internationally as well as nationally. And that agenda, I think we do have to sit and think. You can't organize unless you have a theoretical base, you know the theoretical baggage and the informed by ideology, but without it, nothing. You're in a Kafkaesque situation. But anyway, I'm meant to be in the chair. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm Caroline Turner, and I grew up in a democratic country, and that's a word that I find is very neglected, except when certain countries want to invade other countries to give them democratic rights, which is more like a captured labour pool and so on. Now, I really respect young people. I've got 3 sons who are, you know, on the phone all the time, and I only have my landline and keep in contact with people. In reality, but young people are really smart and they are the future. Now, an old hippie, now deceased and gone to his big poetry performance thing in the sky, Leonard Cohen, on his last album where he didn't hold back, he said, "Once we died to make men free, now we die to make things cheap." Oh, that really hurts. We don't talk about really, as I say, democratic rights anymore much. The Liberal Party agenda, if we really looked at it, it can't be stupidity and bungling. They really seem biased on the thing of central control and discrimination.
Can you move? Is the question about democratic right? Is the question about democracy?
Well, it's basically about that. A previous speaker said we need a new form, but I think we just need to come back to what is really democratic, what are democratic rights. Okay. And for example, the Liberal Party has neglected education, health, and is totally in bed like robber barons with the clergy about religion. Why do we talk about Muslim refugees? Surely all refugees have democratic rights. Let's get back to basics.
Okay.
And how they're translated.
Yeah, I think in terms of democracy and democratic rights, I think it's all, you know, intertwined with social justice. But I think with democracy is something we do see as young people in masses turning away from the major parties. And I think that is to do with young people feeling as though their voice in the democratic process isn't being heard. And I think that's why we kind of tend to see that shift away from the 2 major parties and even away from the Greens. We're seeing more young people supporting like minor, obscure science party things. The guy who got the Opal card inserted into his hand. But I think that's a part of the bigger picture is young people seeing that those democratic rights aren't being upheld and recognising that that's part of a broader scope of human rights issues and social justice issues. Yeah.
Well, I think that democracy, unfortunately, has become the catch cry of the right, as Carolyn pointed out, that it's often used when they're trying to invade the Middle East and, you know, when they're trying to stop the demand for same-sex marriage from happening. They say, oh, the plebiscite's really democratic and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that the left, though, democracy is ours. There just isn't enough of it in capitalist society. Like democracy, even the kind of limited amount that we've got in terms of informing the makeup of Parliament isn't good enough. I think it should be extended into all spheres. We don't have any say over what happens in the workplace, for example. You know, try as they might to say that, you know, you know, same-sex marriage not happening is like the will of the silent majority. They're actually wrong. It's actually the tenacity of the right-wing ruling class that has meant that this thing hasn't happened yet. That's undemocratic. Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but I think that the fact that people are disinterested in the kind of democracy that capitalism has to offer is not a sign that, you know, they don't think that the majority decisions are, young people I'm talking about, the majority decisions are worthless. They just think that, you know, the majority isn't actually being listened to, and that they, you know, a lot of them are striving for something different in that.
Yeah, my name's Gavin, also a certified young person, and I study at Sydney Uni. I just had I wanted to touch on something that someone mentioned earlier in terms of the last question around democracy. I do have a question, and it's very quick. I just wanted to say, I don't actually think we have any democracy under capitalism. The reality is that, you know, you get to vote like every 4 years, whatever, for Labor or Liberal, and then for the next 4 years, they continue to do, you know, exactly what they were supposed to do in the last term, effectively, you know, smashing up workers' rights, continuing the disgusting refugee regime that exists in this country. And then you think about, well, where do all the decisions actually get made in our society? It's at the base, it's the economy, yet ordinary people do not have any control over that whatsoever. And if you even try to, you know, joining a union and fighting against the bosses for better wages, these kind of things, you're basically, you know, put under the thumb by the entire force of the state. And we only have to look at what Hersha was talking about in her talk with the ABCC against the CFMEU. Now to my question. I think what we've been seeing across the world, and small glimpses of it here in Australia, is a shift in people's involvement in politics. And we only have to look at, you know, I mean, in the last couple of years, there's been mass rallies around the questions of, for example, the Arab Spring in 2011, millions of people coming out, not only in the Middle East, but across the globe. And then here in Australia, this year alone, the Invasion Day rallies got 10,000 people out at it, which was a majority young crowd here in Sydney alone, as well as the marriage equality rally that just happened here recently, had about 50,000 people at it, which was one of the most historic and biggest rallies for LGBTI rights in this country. So it's basically a question for both of the speakers tonight. I want to ask, what does this, in your opinion, what does this reflect about the system and the society that we live in? And where do you see this going for both people?
I think that I think we've kind of talked about it a bit already. I think that the injustice that the structures of the society create drives people to resist. And around the world at the moment, we're in the situation post the global financial crisis and the subsequent economic meltdown in a number of places that has really hit people's, you know, living standards, their ability to provide for themselves, or look forward to the ability to do so in the future, in the case of young people. And it just exposes the raw kind of workings of the system for a lot of young people. And that kind of what ends up happening is to say, okay, we can't trust the people in power to do this for us. You know, the institutions of democracy in this country are not doing, they're not expressing our will. That means I have to do something to actually make change. And that's the kind of, I guess, process that went on during a lot of the protests against austerity in Europe and elsewhere, and the Occupy movement, for example. And I think that's an incredibly important thing. And even though we were relatively shielded from the economic crisis here in Australia, we still had a lot of protests directly inspired by what went on elsewhere in the Occupy movement, in the anti-Trump protests earlier this year. You know, that could hit a nerve again in the future, and see those kinds of protest movements springing up again. So, yeah, I think, I'll just leave it there.
I think I was going to say the same thing, is that I think young people are realising that it's not enough just to, not to play into the stereotype, but not enough just to, you know, whine about their problems to their friends or whatever. They actually have to take action and stand up and do something to create change. And I think, young people are really looking into a future that is so uncertain for them. They don't, as we've already discussed, they don't know what their jobs are going to look like. They don't know if the degree they're studying is going to lead them to the field they want. And I think they can very clearly trace that back to a lot of the institutions in place. And I think they know that the only option to make change is to take a stand and do something. But I also think what we've seen develop over the past decade or whatever is a real sense of collective struggle that has always been there. But I think especially for young people, it's comforting and reassuring to some sense to know that, you know, standing in a protest with 50,000 people, it's one struggle and everyone there is fighting for the same thing, and you're not alone in wanting change. And I think that's something that has really encouraged a lot of young people to take action.
Okay, look, I've got a few commercials, and I'll read them quickly, because in a way, if we added them up, they represent an agenda of the kind that Hersha and Isabella have been talking about. The first one refers to a Stop Adani rally, 2 o'clock on Saturday week in Camperdown Memorial Rest Park. On the same Saturday, but at 7 o'clock, a comedy night, feminists laugh back, and all women line up in the Leichhardt Town Hall at 7 p.m. And then 2 weeks time, 2 weeks Sunday, the big march for refugees, walk, ride, roll it's called, bring them here, Sunday the 15th of October, starting at Hyde Park, corner of Elizabeth and Park Street at 2 o'clock. And then a film, again, in a week's time, on Tuesday week. It's called A Well-Founded Fear, and it's about 10 years. Is that? I'm sorry. I can postpone this one. We'll make this announcement. It's not till December. So while we're advertising it now, given you've got enough to think about. Look, let me, on your behalf, thank Hersha and Isabella. I hope you're not exceptions to the rule. I've heard a lot about young people tonight and the value of young people, but I'm reminded, and I've said this before here, that there are 250,000 university students live in this city. And although Gavin mentioned large numbers at certain rallies, I mostly don't see them. And so, at least, I hope you're not exceptions to the rule, but in a way, who cares? Because you've both been great tonight. Thank you very much.